Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. West Valley City, Utah. A quiet suburb tucked against the western edge of the Salt Lake Valley, where the Eau Claire Mountains rise like a wall between the flatlands and the desert beyond. In December of 2009, this was a place where families shoveled snow off their driveways before sunrise, where children waited for school buses under streetlights still glowing in the cold gray dawn, where neighbors waved at each other from behind frosted car windows, and nobody locked their doors during the day. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, the kind of place where people moved specifically because nothing ever happened. The houses looked the same, modest, single-story, beige and brown, built close together on streets with names that sounded like they came from a developer's brochure. Cul-de-sacs curved into quiet circles. Lawns disappeared under blankets of white for months at a time. The air in December tasted like metal and pine, and the sky turned the color of old cement by 3 in the afternoon. On the evening of December 6, 2009, the temperature in West Valley City dropped below freezing. A thin crust of ice had formed over the snow that had fallen days earlier, and the wind came down from the mountains sharp enough to sting any exposed skin. By 8 o'clock, most of the houses on Sarah Circle were dark or dimming. Televisions flickered behind curtains. Porch lights cast small amber pools on icy front steps. It was a Sunday night, the kind of night where people finished dinner early, put the kids to bed, and settled in for the start of another week. At the Powell residence, a small house near the end of the street, the lights were on. Inside, Susan Powell was putting her 2 young sons to bed. Charlie was 4 years old, Braden was 2. They were small, round-faced boys with wide eyes and messy hair, the kind of children who clung to their mother's legs in public and laughed too loudly at cartoons. Susan read to them, tucked their blankets around their shoulders, kissed their foreheads, and closed the door to their bedroom softly, the way she always did. She may have stood in the hallway for a moment. She may have listened for their breathing to slow. She may have walked to the living room and sat down on the couch, pulled a blanket over her lap, and looked at nothing in particular. Nobody knows exactly what happened after that. What is known is that by the next morning, Susan Powell was gone. Her purse was in the house. Her car was in the garage. Her phone was on the counter. Her shoes were by the door. Her coat was hanging in the closet. 2 fans had been left running in the living room, blowing cold air across a wet spot on the carpet. The house smelled faintly of cleaning solution. And Josh Powell, her husband, was not home either. Neither were the boys. When Susan did not show up for work on Monday morning, her coworkers grew concerned almost immediately. Susan was not the kind of person who missed work without calling. She was not the kind of person who disappeared without telling someone. She was punctual, reliable, organized to a degree that some might have called obsessive. She kept calendars. She kept lists. She kept a journal that she updated regularly and stored in a safety deposit box at her bank, a detail that would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. When her employer could not reach her by phone, they called her friends. When her friends could not reach her, they called her family. When her family could not reach her, someone called the police, and the police went to Sarah Circle. And they found the house empty. And they found the wet carpet. And they found the fans. And they began asking questions that would not be fully answered for years, if they have ever been fully answered at all. This is the story of Susan Powell, and it is one of the most disturbing, most heartbreaking, and most infuriating cases in modern American true crime history. Not because of what happened to Susan, though what happened to her was almost certainly terrible, but because of everything that happened after. Because of the system that failed her. Because of the people who could have saved her children and did not. Because of the man who sat at the center of it all, looked into cameras, spoke to reporters, hired lawyers, and never once told the truth. This case has everything. A lying husband, a predatory father-in-law, journals that read like warnings from beyond the grave, Digital evidence buried in hard drives. Children who may have known more than anyone realized. And an ending so violent, so sudden, and so preventable that it changed laws in the state of Washington and left an entire nation asking how this was allowed to happen. Let me take you back to the beginning. Susan Mary Cox was born on October 16, 1981 in Alamogordo, New Mexico, a small city in the south-central part of the state known mostly for its proximity to White Sands and Holloman Air Force Base. She was the youngest of 4 children born to Chuck and Judy Cox. Her siblings, Mary, Denise, and John, were older, and Susan grew up as the baby of the family in the way that youngest children often do. Adored, a little spoiled, and fiercely attached to her parents. By all accounts, Susan was the kind of child who drew people in. She was bright, talkative, and had a smile that her mother later described as the kind that could change the energy of a room. She was involved in her church from a young age. The Cox family were active members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and she participated in youth programs, sang in choirs, and helped organize community events before she was old enough to drive. She liked music, she liked art. She was a natural caretaker. The kind of girl who noticed when someone at school was sitting alone and walked over to sit with them. The Cox family moved several times during Susan's childhood, eventually settling in the Pacific Northwest. Susan attended high school in Oregon and later in Washington State, where she graduated and began thinking about her future with the kind of earnest optimism that defined her personality. She wanted a family. She wanted stability. She wanted a home filled with love and laughter and children, a life built on faith and kindness and hard work. These were not abstract dreams for Susan, they were plans. She wrote about them in her journals with a specificity that makes reading those entries now almost unbearable in hindsight. She wanted to be a mother more than anything. Susan was active in her local LDS congregation, and it was through the church social network that she first met Joshua Powell. Josh was a few years older than Susan, tall, with dark hair and a quiet intensity that some people found charming and others found unsettling. He had grown up in Puyallup, Washington, in a household that was, by any reasonable measure, deeply dysfunctional, though the full extent of that dysfunction would not become public knowledge until years later. Josh's father, Stephen Powell, was a man who maintained a careful public image of normalcy, while harboring obsessions and behaviors that would eventually land him in prison. Josh's mother, Terica, had endured years of emotional abuse before the couple divorced. The Powell household was one of control, manipulation, secrecy, and strange, shifting power dynamics that left lasting marks on everyone who grew up inside it. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when Susan met Josh, most of this was hidden behind closed doors. Josh presented himself as a quiet, intelligent young man who shared Susan's faith and values. He was attentive, he was persistent, and Susan, who was young and hopeful and looking for exactly the kind of partnership she had always dreamed about, fell for him. They were married on April 6, 2001. Susan was 19 years old. The early years of the marriage were complicated almost from the start, though Susan worked hard to present a positive face to the world. The couple settled in Utah, where Josh had found work, and Susan threw herself into building the life she had always imagined. She kept the house clean. She cooked meals from scratch. She decorated with care on a tight budget, turning their modest rental into something warm and inviting. She was the kind of wife and mother, once the children came, who handmade Halloween costumes, baked cupcakes for church functions, organized photo albums, and kept detailed records of every milestone in her sons' lives. Charlie was born in 2005, Braden followed in 2007, and with their arrival something in Susan seemed to solidify. A sense of purpose, a center of gravity that held her steady even as the ground beneath her marriage was beginning to shift. Because the marriage was not good. It had perhaps never been good, not really. Not in the way Susan had hoped. Josh was controlling. He managed the finances with an iron grip, giving Susan an allowance and monitoring her spending. He was emotionally distant, often cold, sometimes cruel in small ways that left no visible marks, but accumulated over time like frost building on a window. He belittled her in front of others. He dismissed her opinions. He made decisions about their lives without consulting her and presented them as facts she was expected to accept. Susan documented all of this. Not publicly, she was too proud for that, too committed to the image of the happy family she had worked so hard to create. But privately, in her journals, she wrote with a clarity and honesty that is startling to read now. She described Josh's behavior in detail. She described her own feelings, her frustration, her sadness, her growing fear that the life she had built was not sustainable. She wrote about wanting to leave. She wrote about being afraid to leave. She wrote about her sons, about how much she loved them, about how she would do anything to protect them. And then she wrote something that would later be read aloud in courtrooms and broadcast on national television. She wrote that if anything happened to her, people should look at Josh. She did not write this once. She wrote it multiple times in different ways over a period of months. She told friends the same thing. She told her family. She was not being dramatic. She was not being paranoid. She was a woman who had looked carefully at her situation, assessed the danger she was in, and tried to leave a record, a trail of breadcrumbs, in case the worst happened. The worst happened. But before we get there, it is important to understand the full landscape of Susan's life in the months leading up to her disappearance. Because the Susan Powell case is not just a story about a missing woman and a suspicious husband. It is a story about systems, about the way institutions and individuals can see danger clearly and still fail to act. It is about the slow accumulation of warning signs that are ignored, minimized, explained away, or buried under bureaucratic caution and legal technicalities. And it is about the children, always about the children, who were caught in the middle and ultimately destroyed by the very people who were supposed to protect them. In the fall of 2009, Susan's marriage to Josh had reached a breaking point. She had been quietly consulting with a divorce attorney. She had been setting aside small amounts of money, difficult, given Josh's financial control, in preparation for the day she would leave. She had updated her will. She had spoken to her parents about the possibility of returning to Washington State with the boys. She had taken steps, careful steps, the kind of steps that a woman takes when she knows she is in danger, but also knows that leaving can be the most dangerous moment of all. Josh, for his part, seemed to sense that something was shifting. According to friends and family members who later spoke to investigators, Josh's behavior in the weeks before December 6th had become more erratic. He was more withdrawn than usual. He was spending long hours on his computer. He was making comments to Susan that she found unsettling, comments about life insurance, about what would happen if one of them died, about loyalty and betrayal. He was, in the language of domestic violence experts, escalating. And then there was Stephen Powell, and Josh's father had, by 2009, developed what can only be described as an obsession with Susan. He had been writing about her in his own journals. Journals that would later be seized by police and would reveal a pattern of fixation that went far beyond anything that could be called normal. Stephen Powell wrote about Susan in romantic and sexual terms. He wrote that he believed Susan was secretly in love with him. He took photographs of her without her knowledge, photographs that were intimate, invasive, and deeply disturbing. He recorded her in the bathroom. He collected images of her in various states of undress, taken through windows or when she did not know she was being watched. Susan knew something was wrong with Stephen, even if she did not know the full extent of it. She had told Josh that his father made her uncomfortable. She had told friends that Stephen said inappropriate things to her, that he stood too close, that he looked at her in ways that made her skin crawl. She had tried to limit her contact with him, but Josh, who maintained a disturbingly close relationship with his father, dismissed her concerns. He told her she was overreacting. He told her she was imagining things. He told her that his father was just being friendly. This dynamic, Susan's fear, Josh's dismissal, Stephen's predatory behavior lurking in the background, was the toxic ecosystem in which the Powell family existed in the months and weeks before Susan vanished. It was a pressure cooker, and on the night of December 6, 2009, it exploded. Here is what Josh Powell told the police when they finally made contact with him. He said that on Sunday evening, December 6th, he had decided to take Charlie and Braden camping. At midnight, in the middle of a snowstorm, in December in Utah, he said he had loaded the boys into the family minivan, driven to a remote area in the West Desert, a vast empty stretch of land west of Salt Lake City, and set up a campsite in the freezing cold. He said the boys had slept in the van. He said he had returned home Monday afternoon and found the house empty. He said he did not know where Susan was. He said he had not heard from her. He said he was not worried. He said all of this with a calm that detectives found remarkable. The story was, on its face, absurd. No reasonable person takes a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old camping in sub-zero temperatures at midnight on a Sunday, when everyone has school and work the next day. The explanation defied logic, defied common sense, defied every known pattern of Josh Powell's behavior. He was not an outdoorsman. He did not regularly take the boys on trips, and there was no evidence that any camping trip had been planned in advance. There were no supplies packed, no tent food, nothing that would suggest a legitimate outing, but Josh stuck to his story. He repeated it with minor variations. Sometimes the timing shifted, sometimes the destination changed slightly, but the core remained the same. He went camping, he came home. Susan was gone. He did not know where she was. He had nothing to do with her disappearance. The police did not believe him. Nobody believed him. But belief and proof are two very different things, and in the Susan Powell case, that gap between what everyone knew and what anyone could prove became a chasm that swallowed everything: justice, accountability, and ultimately, two small boys who deserved so much better than what they got. The West Valley City Police Department opened a missing persons investigation on December 7, 2009. From the very first day, Josh Powell was treated as a person of interest. Detectives processed the house on Sarah Circle and found several things that did not align with an innocent explanation. The wet spot on the living room carpet, the two large fans blowing air across it, as if someone had been trying to dry something, the faint odor of cleaning products, Susan's personal belongings. All of them, every item a person would take if they were leaving voluntarily, still in the house. Her purse, her wallet, her identification, her phone, her keys, her medication, her coat. There was no sign of forced entry. There was no sign that anyone from outside the home had come in. The doors had been locked. The windows were intact. Whatever had happened to Susan Powell had happened inside that house. And it had happened while Josh Powell was the only other adult present. Detectives also noted something else during their initial search: the two children. Charlie and Braden were brought home by Josh on Monday afternoon, hours after Susan had been reported missing. They were cold, tired, and confused. Charlie, at 4 years old, was old enough to speak, old enough to understand questions, old enough to have memories. And in the days and weeks that followed, Charlie would say things, small, fragmented things, the way children do, that suggested he had seen or heard something on the night his mother disappeared. He told a preschool teacher that his mother had gone camping with them, but did not come back. He drew pictures that investigators found troubling. He made comments about his mother being in the trunk. These statements were not given under formal interrogation. Charlie was 4, and the standards for interviewing child witnesses are strict, but they were documented, reported, and added to a growing file of circumstantial evidence that pointed in one direction and one direction only: Josh Powell. But Josh did not confess. He did not crack under questioning. He did not make the mistake that so many guilty people make in the first hours and days after a crime, when the pressure is highest and the lies are hardest to maintain. Instead, Josh did something that would define the entire course of this case. He lawyered up immediately. He stopped cooperating with police. He stopped answering questions, and then, within weeks of Susan's disappearance, he packed up his sons and moved to Puyallup, Washington, to his father Stephen Powell's house. He moved into the home of a man who had been secretly photographing and recording his missing wife for years. The Cox family, Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy, and her siblings, were devastated. They had known from the first moment that something was wrong. They had known from the first moment that Josh was responsible. And now they were watching him take their grandchildren across state lines, away from the investigation, away from the people who loved Susan, and into the home of a man they had always distrusted. They felt powerless. They felt terrified. And they began a fight, a legal, public, exhausting fight to get custody of Charlie and Braden, a fight that would consume years of their lives and end in a way that nobody could have predicted and nobody will ever fully recover from. The investigation in Utah continued. Detectives searched the West Desert, focusing on the area where Josh claimed to have gone camping. They brought in cadaver dogs. They brought in ground-penetrating radar. They searched abandoned mine shafts and dry washes and remote stretches of desert where the only sounds were wind and the distant hum of power lines. They found nothing. Susan's body has never been found, and to this day, nobody except Josh Powell and possibly Stephen Powell ever knew where she was. The police also executed search warrants on the Powell home and on Josh's computers, phones, and electronic devices. What they found on those devices would take months to analyze fully. But even the early returns were damning. Josh had conducted internet searches in the days and weeks before Susan's disappearance that included topics no innocent person would be researching. He had searched for information about how to dispose of a body. He had searched for remote areas in the Utah desert. He had searched for cleaning solutions and their effectiveness at removing biological evidence. None of this by itself was enough to charge him. In the American legal system, circumstantial evidence can be powerful, but it requires a certain critical mass, a body, a weapon, a confession, a witness, a piece of physical evidence that closes the loop. Prosecutors in Utah were cautious. They wanted to build an airtight case. They did not want to charge Josh Powell prematurely and risk an acquittal that would make it impossible to try him again. So they waited. They built. And Josh, safe in his father's house in Washington, began constructing a narrative. He gave interviews to local media in which he portrayed himself as a grieving husband, a devoted father, a man who had been unfairly targeted by police and media. He suggested that Susan had run away, that she had been unhappy, that she had mental health issues, that she had perhaps met someone online and left voluntarily. He floated theories about Susan being alive somewhere, living a secret life, abandoning her children by choice. These claims were not just false, they were cruel. They were designed to shift blame onto the victim, to muddy the waters, to create enough doubt in the public mind that Josh could continue to live freely. And to some extent they worked. Not with the police, who never wavered in their focus on Josh. Not with the Cox family, who saw through every word. But with some members of the public, and with the legal system, which requires proof beyond reasonable doubt and which was, in this case, maddeningly slow to act. Meanwhile, in the house in Puyallup, Charlie and Braden were growing up in an environment that child welfare experts would later describe as deeply inappropriate. Stephen Powell's home was filled with the evidence of his obsessions, though the full extent of this would not be discovered until later. Josh and Stephen maintained a united front, a father-son alliance that seemed designed to protect each other above all else. Josh homeschooled the boys. He limited their contact with the Cox family. He fought every legal effort by Chuck and Judy Cox to gain visitation rights, and when courts did grant the Coxes limited access, Josh placed conditions and restrictions that made meaningful contact difficult. The boys were, in every practical sense, hostages. Not in chains, not in a locked room, but in a psychological prison built by their father and grandfather, isolated from the people who loved them most, raised in a household where their mother's name was spoken only in the context of lies, and denied the truth about what had happened on the night of December 6, 2009. Susan's friends and family did everything they could. They organized search parties. They distributed flyers. They created a website and social media pages dedicated to finding Susan. They appeared on national television, Dateline 48 Hours, America's Most Wanted, and told Susan's story to anyone who would listen. Chuck Cox, Susan's father, became the public face of the family's fight. He was a quiet, steady man who carried his grief with a dignity that made his rare moments of visible anguish all the more powerful. He spoke about Susan with a tenderness that made it clear she was not just a missing person, not just a case number, not just a name on a flyer. She was his daughter. She was a mother. She was real. And the investigation continued to build. Piece by piece, detail by detail, the evidence against Josh Powell accumulated. Detectives obtained Susan's journals from the safety deposit box and found her warnings, her explicit statements that if something happened to her, Josh should be the primary suspect. They obtained financial records showing that Josh had taken out a large life insurance policy on Susan shortly before her disappearance. They obtained phone records, GPS data, computer search histories, and witness statements that, taken together, painted a picture of a man who had planned and executed the murder of his wife with cold, methodical precision. But they still did not have a body. They still did not have a confession. And the prosecutors in Utah continued to deliberate, continued to weigh the risks of going to trial without those crucial pieces of evidence, continued to add to the file and hope that the breakthrough would come. The months turned into a year. The year turned into 2. Susan remained missing, Josh remained free. The boys remained in Puyallup. And the Cox family remained locked in a legal battle that was slowly draining their finances, their energy, and their hope. Then, in the fall of 2011, something happened that changed the trajectory of the case, though not in the way anyone expected. On September 22, 2011, police in Pierce County, Washington, executed a search warrant on Stephen Powell's home. The warrant was related to voyeurism charges. Stephen had been caught with thousands of images of women and girls taken secretly, many of them from his own neighborhood. During the search, police also found the journals, the photographs, and the recordings that revealed the full scope of Stephen's obsession with Susan. They found images of Susan taken without her knowledge. They found written fantasies about Susan. They found evidence that Stephen had been surveilling Susan for years, documenting her movements, her body, her daily routines with a meticulousness that bordered on the clinical. Stephen Powell was arrested and charged with voyeurism. He was also charged with possession of images of minors, a charge that would later be the subject of significant legal proceedings. The arrest was a seismic event in the case, not because it directly implicated Stephen and Susan's disappearance, but because it accomplished 2 things. First, it removed Josh Powell's primary ally and protector. And second, it placed the boys in the care of the state, because a judge ruled that the home of an accused voyeur was not an appropriate environment for 2 young children. Charlie and Braden were temporarily placed in foster care. The Cox family immediately filed for custody, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, there was a real possibility that the boys might be returned to people who genuinely loved them. People who would tell them the truth about their mother. People who would raise them in safety and warmth and honesty. Josh Powell must have known that losing custody of the boys meant losing his last shield. As long as he had the children, he had leverage. He had a reason to remain sympathetic, the single father, the devoted dad, the man just trying to raise his sons. Without them, he was just a suspect. Without them, the full weight of the investigation, the media scrutiny, and the Cox family's legal offensive would fall on him alone, and there would be nothing to deflect it. And so, as the custody proceedings moved forward in late 2011 and early 2012, Josh Powell made preparations. He made them quietly, methodically, the same way he had apparently made preparations on the night of December 6, 2009. He rented a house in Graham, Washington, a rural area south of Puyallup. He told the real estate agent he needed something with a big yard for his boys. He moved in, he set up the house. He made it look like a home. But he was not building a home, he was building something else entirely. On February 1, 2012, a Washington state judge reviewed the custody case and ordered that Josh Powell undergo a psychosexual evaluation as a condition of regaining custody of Charlie and Braden. The evaluation was standard procedure in cases where a parent had been living in a household with someone charged with voyeurism and possession of images involving minors. It was not an unusual request. It was not punitive, it was, by every legal and psychological standard, a reasonable precaution designed to ensure the safety of 2 small boys who had already been through more than any child should ever have to endure. Josh refused. He did not refuse publicly. He did not refuse loudly. He simply did not comply. He delayed, he made excuses. He communicated through his attorney that he found the requirement invasive and unnecessary. He argued that he was a good father, that the charges against his own father had nothing to do with him, that the court was punishing him for someone else's crimes. His attorney filed motions. The court set deadlines. Josh ignored them. And while this legal theater played out, the Cox family waited. Chuck and Judy Cox had been granted supervised visitation with the boys during this period, and every visit was a reminder of what they were fighting for. Charlie was 6 now. Braden was 4. They were growing fast, changing in ways that Susan would never see. Charlie had started to look more like his mother, the same eyes, the same smile, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking about something. Braden was quieter, more reserved. But he clung to his grandparents with a need that was almost physical, as if his small body understood something his mind could not yet articulate. The boys were being cared for by a foster family, and a court-appointed social worker was responsible for facilitating visits between Josh and his sons. These visits were supervised. Josh was not allowed to be alone with the boys, and they followed a strict schedule. Every Sunday, the social worker would bring Charlie and Braden to Josh's new house in Graham for a 2-hour visit. She would drop them off at the door. Josh would take them inside, and 2 hours later she would pick them up. This arrangement had been in place for several weeks by early February 2012. The visits had been, by all external accounts, uneventful. Josh played with the boys. He gave them snacks. He talked to them about school and cartoons and the things that small children talk about. The social worker reported no concerns. The foster family reported that the boys returned from visits in good spirits. Everything seemed, on the surface, to be proceeding normally. But nothing about Josh Powell was normal. Nothing about Josh Powell had ever been normal. And the people who knew him best, the detectives who had spent 2 years investigating him, the Cox family who had watched him lie and manipulate and evade for 26 months, Susan herself, who had written in her journals that this man was capable of terrible things. All of them would have told anyone who asked that Josh Powell should never, under any circumstances, be left alone with those children. Not for 2 hours, not for 2 minutes, not for 2 seconds. But the system did not listen to them. The system followed its procedures. The system checked its boxes. The system operated on the assumption that a supervised visit to a parent's home, facilitated by a trained social worker, was a safe and appropriate arrangement. The system did not account for the possibility that the parent in question had already killed once and was prepared to kill again. February 5, 2012. A Sunday. The weather in Graham, Washington, was cold and gray, the kind of Pacific Northwest winter day where the sky hangs low and heavy, and the light never quite makes it past a dull pewter glow. The social worker, Elizabeth Griffin Hall, picked up Charlie and Braden from their foster home that morning and drove them to Josh's house for their scheduled visit. She pulled into the driveway at approximately 20:05 p.m. The house was a single-story rental on a quiet road surrounded by trees. It looked ordinary. It looked like any house. Elizabeth walked the boys to the front door. Charlie and Braden ran ahead of her, the way children do when they are excited to see a parent. They reached the door first. Josh opened it. The boys rushed inside. Elizabeth was a few steps behind them, walking up the porch. She reached the door, and Josh Powell looked at her, stepped back, and closed the door in her face. She heard the lock click. Elizabeth stood on the porch for a moment, confused. This was not part of the routine. Josh had always let her inside. She knocked on the door. No answer. She called out Josh's name. Nothing. She tried the handle locked. She pulled out her phone and called her supervisor. She told her supervisor what had happened. She said she could smell something chemical, something sharp, something that was seeping through the cracks of the door and the seams of the windows. She said she was worried. Her supervisor told her to call 911. Elizabeth called 911 at 12:09 p.m. She told the dispatcher that she was a social worker, that she had brought 2 children to their father's house for a supervised visit, that the father had locked her out, and that she could smell gasoline. The dispatcher asked her to confirm the address. Elizabeth confirmed it. The dispatcher told her that help was on the way. Inside the house, something was already happening. Something that had been planned for days, maybe weeks, maybe longer. Josh Powell had prepared the house. He had removed most of the furniture. He had placed containers of gasoline throughout the rooms. He had disconnected the smoke detectors. He had made arrangements, legal arrangements, financial arrangements. The kind of arrangements a person makes when they know they are not going to need anything anymore. He had sent emails. He had made phone calls. He had, according to later analysis of his computer, visited websites related to methods of causing fires and explosions in the days before February 5th. He had turned his home into a death trap, and he had waited for his sons to walk through the door. What happened inside that house in the minutes between 12:05 and 12:10 p.m. has been reconstructed from forensic evidence, autopsy reports, and the analysis of fire investigators. The full truth of those minutes, what the boys saw, what they said, what they understood, will never be known. But the evidence tells a story that is almost impossible to read without looking away. Josh Powell took a hatchet to his sons. Charlie and Braden were attacked the moment they entered the house. The medical examiner's report later determined that both boys sustained chopping injuries to the head and neck consistent with a hatchet or similar bladed instrument. The injuries were severe. They were inflicted by an adult with full force against children who weighed less than 50 pounds. Charlie, at 6, may have understood what was happening. He may have tried to run. He may have screamed. Braden, at 4, may not have had time to understand anything at all. After attacking the boys, Josh ignited the gasoline. The explosion was massive. It blew out the windows. It sent a fireball through the house that was visible from the road. Neighbors heard the blast and came running. Elizabeth, still standing in the driveway, still on the phone with 911, felt the heat hit her face like a wall. She screamed. She ran toward the house. She could not get close. The flames were already consuming the structure, pouring from every opening, turning the house into a furnace. Fire trucks arrived within minutes. By the time firefighters were able to enter the structure, the house was fully engulfed. They found 3 bodies inside: Josh Powell, Charlie Powell, Braden Powell. All 3 were dead. The medical examiner later determined that Charlie and Braden died from a combination of their injuries and carbon monoxide inhalation. Josh died from the fire. He had positioned himself near the point of ignition, ensuring that there would be no escape, no rescue, no possibility of survival. He had murdered his sons and killed himself, rather than face the consequences of what he had done to their mother. The news spread across the country within hours. By that evening, the story was on every major network. Anchors who had covered hundreds of crime stories sat behind their desks with expressions that were visibly shaken. Reporters who had followed the Susan Powell case for 2 years struggled to maintain their composure on camera. The details were so horrific, so deliberately cruel, so calculated in their execution that even people who covered violence for a living found themselves unable to process what had happened. And the questions began immediately. How was this allowed to happen? How was a man who was the primary suspect in his wife's disappearance given unsupervised access to his children? How was a social worker, a trained, experienced professional, sent to a house with no law enforcement backup, no safety plan, no contingency for the possibility that the parent might do exactly what everyone who knew him feared he would do? How did the system fail so completely, so catastrophically, so fatally? These were not rhetorical questions. They demanded answers, and the answers, when they came, were as infuriating as the tragedy itself. The Washington State Department of Social and Health Services conducted an internal review. The review found that the case had been handled according to existing protocols. Supervised visits were standard practice. The social worker had followed procedure. The court had followed procedure. Everyone had followed procedure. And 2 children were dead. The problem was the procedure itself. Under Washington state law at the time, a parent's rights were given enormous weight in custody proceedings. Even a parent who was the primary suspect in a murder investigation, even a parent who had fled across state lines, who had moved into the home of an accused voyeur, who had refused to cooperate with police, who had refused to undergo a psychosexual evaluation, retained significant legal rights to access his children. The standard for terminating parental rights was extraordinarily high, and the standard for restricting visitation was nearly as high. Courts were required to prioritize family reunification. Social workers were required to facilitate contact between parents and children. The entire system was built on the assumption that parents, even deeply flawed parents, were generally better for children than the state. This assumption killed Charlie and Braden Powell. Chuck Cox knew it. He had been saying it for months, for years. He had stood in courtrooms and told judges that Josh Powell was dangerous. He had filed motions and affidavits and declarations detailing Josh's behavior, his lies, his refusal to cooperate, his connection to Stephen Powell's crimes. He had begged, the word is not too strong, he had begged the court to protect his grandchildren. And the court had listened, had nodded, had expressed concern, and had sent the boys back to Josh's door every Sunday. After the deaths, Chuck Cox did something remarkable. He did not retreat into his grief. He did not disappear. He channeled his devastation into advocacy. He became one of the most visible and effective campaigners for child custody reform in the state of Washington and beyond. He testified before the Washington state legislature. He pushed for changes in the way courts handle custody cases involving parents suspected of violent crimes. He argued for laws that would give judges greater authority to restrict or deny visitation when there was credible evidence of danger. He argued for better training for social workers. He argued for mandatory safety assessments. He argued for the simple, obvious principle that the safety of children should precedence over the rights of parents, always without exception. Full stop. And the legislature listened. In 2012 and the years that followed, Washington state passed several pieces of legislation that became collectively known as the Charlie and Braden Powell laws. These laws expanded the grounds for restricting parental visitation. They required courts to consider pending criminal investigations when making custody decisions. They mandated that social workers conduct safety assessments before facilitating visits with parents involved in violent crime cases. They gave judges greater discretion to deny unsupervised access when there was evidence of danger. These laws were too late for Charlie and Braden. They were too late for Susan. But they may have saved other children, other families, other lives that would have been lost to the same systemic failures that allowed Josh Powell to do what he did. And that, the idea that something good could come from something so terrible, was the only source of comfort that Chuck Cox could find in the aftermath of a tragedy that had taken his daughter, his grandsons, and every future he had ever imagined for his family. But the story of what happened on February 5, 2012, did not end with the fire. There were still questions about Susan, about what Josh had done with her, about whether her body would ever be found. There were still investigations. There were still legal proceedings. And there was still Stephen Powell, sitting in a jail cell in Pierce County, Washington, waiting for his own trial. Let me go back now. Let me go back to the investigation, to the evidence, to the slow, painstaking work that detectives in Utah and Washington had been doing for 2 years before the fire. Because the story of how the case was built, and the story of how it was ultimately left unfinished, is as important as the story of how it ended. After Susan's disappearance in December 2009, the West Valley City Police Department assigned a team of detectives to the case full-time. The lead detective was Ellis Maxwell, a veteran investigator who had handled homicide cases before but had never encountered anything quite like this. The case was unusual from the start, not because the evidence was thin, but because the evidence was overwhelming and yet insufficient. Everything pointed to Josh. Nothing pointed to anyone else. And yet the one thing that prosecutors needed most, Susan's body, remained missing. The investigation proceeded along multiple tracks simultaneously. The first track was the physical search for Susan. Detectives and volunteers combed the West Desert, thousands of square miles of desolate, frozen terrain, looking for any sign of her. They used cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, aerial surveillance, and old-fashioned grid searches. They checked abandoned mine shafts, wells, and water sources. They searched along roads and highways that Josh could have used on the night of December 6th. They examined cell tower data and GPS records from Josh's phone and vehicle to try to reconstruct his movements. The cell tower data was particularly revealing. Josh's phone had pinged towers in the West Desert area in the early morning hours of December 7th, consistent with his claim of having gone camping, but also consistent with having driven to a remote location to dispose of a body. The data showed that Josh had been in an area near a set of abandoned mine shafts, far from any established campground, far from any road that a person would take for a recreational outing with two small children in the middle of a freezing December night. Detectives focused their physical search on this area, but the terrain was vast and the conditions were brutal. Winter storms had covered the ground with fresh snow multiple times since December 6th, and any evidence left on the surface would have been buried or destroyed. The second track was the digital investigation. Josh Powell's computers, phones, and electronic devices were seized and sent to forensic analysts. The analysis took months. Josh had multiple computers, external hard drives, and storage devices, and the volume of data was enormous. But the results were devastating for Josh's claims of innocence. Analysts found internet searches conducted in the days and weeks before Susan's disappearance that included queries about body decomposition rates, cleaning products and their ability to remove blood, disposal methods for human remains, and remote areas in the Utah desert. They found that Josh had researched the specific area, where his cell phone later pinged on the night of December 6th. They found that he had deleted large quantities of data from his computers in the days after Susan's disappearance, data that forensic analysts were able to partially recover. They also found something else. They found evidence that Josh had been conducting surveillance on Susan for months before her disappearance. He had been monitoring her email. He had been tracking her phone. He had been reading her communications with friends and family members. He knew that she had been consulting with a divorce attorney. He knew that she was planning to leave him. He knew about the journals and the safety deposit box. He knew everything. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a man who snapped under pressure, who lost control in a moment of rage, who did something terrible and then panicked. This was premeditated. This was planned. This was a man who saw his wife preparing to leave, who understood that her departure would expose him, who calculated that the only way to maintain control was to eliminate her entirely, and who then spent weeks researching the best way to do it. The third track of the investigation involved witness interviews. Detectives spoke to dozens of people, Susan's coworkers, friends, church members, neighbors, family members on both sides. The picture that emerged was consistent and damning. Susan had been afraid of Josh. She had told multiple people that she feared for her safety. She had told her bishop at the LDS church that Josh had become increasingly aggressive. She had told coworkers that she was planning to leave. She had told her parents that if anything happened to her, they should not believe anything Josh said. Josh's behavior after the disappearance was equally telling. He had shown no emotion when told that Susan was missing. He had not participated in search efforts. He had not made public appeals for her return. He had not cooperated with police for initial and transparently false statement about the camping trip. He had hired a defense attorney within days. He had moved across state lines within weeks. He had begun floating alternative theories about Susan's disappearance that were designed to deflect suspicion rather than help find her. And then there were the things that Josh did not do. He did not call Susan's phone. He did not text her. He did not email her. He did not reach out to her friends or family to ask if they had heard from her. He did not contact hospitals or shelters. He did not file a missing persons report himself. That was done by Susan's employer and friends. He behaved, in every measurable way, like a man who already knew that his wife was dead, because he was the one who had killed her. The fourth track involved Susan's journals and personal records. These were, in many ways, the most powerful evidence in the case. Not because they proved what happened on December 6th, but because they proved who Josh Powell was and what Susan feared he would do. The journals spanned years. They documented Josh's controlling behavior, his financial manipulation, his emotional cruelty, his escalating aggression. They documented Susan's growing fear. They documented her plans to leave. And they documented, in Susan's own handwriting, her belief that Josh was capable of killing her. One entry, written months before her disappearance, read in language that investigators would later describe as chillingly prescient. Susan wrote about the life insurance policies. She wrote about Josh's behavior changing. She wrote about feeling trapped. And she wrote, plainly, directly, without melodrama, that if she died, it would not be an accident, and that Josh would be responsible. Susan had done everything right. She had recognized the danger. She had documented it. She had told people. She had made plans to leave. She had taken every precaution that domestic violence experts recommend, and still it was not enough. Because the reality of domestic violence is that no amount of planning, no amount of documentation, no amount of warning can guarantee safety when the other person has decided that control matters more than life. The investigation continued through 2010 and 2011. Tips came in from across the country. People who thought they had seen Susan. People who claimed to have information. People who wanted to help. Most of the tips led nowhere. A few were investigated thoroughly and turned out to be dead ends. The frustration among the investigative team was palpable. They had a suspect, they had motive, they had opportunity, they had digital evidence, witness testimony, and the victim's own words pointing directly at Josh Powell. But they did not have a body, and without a body, the prosecutors in Utah were reluctant to move forward. This reluctance was understandable from a legal standpoint. No body homicide cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute. Without a body, the defense can argue that the victim is still alive. Without a body, there is no physical evidence of the manner or cause of death. Without a body, the prosecution must convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that a murder occurred based entirely on circumstantial evidence. It can be done, it has been done many times, but the risk of acquittal is higher, and an acquittal would mean that Josh Powell could never be tried again. So the prosecutors waited. And while they waited, Josh Powell lived in his father's house in Puyallup, raised his sons in an environment saturated with lies and secrets, and continued to proclaim his innocence to anyone who would listen. There were moments during this period when it seemed like a break might come. In 2010, a friend of Josh's came forward and told investigators that Josh had made statements suggesting he knew more about Susan's disappearance than he had admitted. The friend described conversations in which Josh had been evasive, contradictory, and at times almost taunting, as if he enjoyed the fact that he had done something terrible and gotten away with it. The friend's statements were compelling but not definitive. They added to the weight of circumstantial evidence, but did not provide the breakthrough that prosecutors needed. In 2011, the discovery of Stephen Powell's journals and photographs during the voyeurism investigation opened a new avenue. Detectives in Washington State and Utah began examining the possibility that Stephen had been involved in Susan's disappearance, not as the primary perpetrator, but as an accomplice or accessory after the fact. Stephen's obsession with Susan was well documented. His willingness to protect Josh was absolute, and his home in Puyallup had been for nearly 2 years. A place where evidence could have been hidden, destroyed, or manipulated without detection. The search of Stephen's home yielded thousands of items, journals, photographs, computer files, storage media. The volume of material was staggering, and the analysis took months. Among the items seized were several that investigators found particularly significant. Journals in which Stephen described his feelings about Susan in graphic detail. Photographs taken of Susan without her knowledge over a period of years. And computer files that appeared to have been transferred from Josh's devices to Stephen's. The relationship between Josh and Stephen was itself a subject of investigation. Detectives had long suspected that the two men operated as a unit, that Stephen provided Josh with emotional support, practical assistance, and a safe haven in exchange for access to Josh's family and, specifically, to Susan. The dynamics of this relationship were complex and disturbing. Stephen was the dominant personality, Josh was the obedient son, and Susan was the object that bound them together. The woman they both wanted to control, for different but equally predatory reasons. Whether Stephen knew in advance what Josh planned to do on the night of December 6th is a question that has never been definitively answered. Whether Stephen helped Josh dispose of Susan's body is another question that remains open. What is known is that Stephen never told the truth about anything related to Susan's disappearance, that he actively assisted Josh in evading the investigation, and that he used his own legal troubles as a shield against further questioning about Susan. Stephen Powell went to trial on the voyeurism charges in May 2012, 3 months after Josh's murder-suicide. He was convicted and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. The conviction was later overturned on appeal due to procedural issues, but Stephen was retried on related charges and ultimately served time. He was released from prison in 2014 and died of a heart attack in 2018. He never told anyone what he knew about Susan. He never cooperated with investigators. He took whatever knowledge he had to his grave, and so the case of Susan Powell remains, in the strictly legal sense, unsolved. No one was ever charged with her murder. No one was ever convicted. Her body has never been found. The man who almost certainly killed her is dead. The man who almost certainly helped him is dead. The children who might have eventually been able to provide testimony are dead. The only people left are the ones who loved Susan, her parents, her siblings, her friends, and the investigators who spent years trying to find justice for her, and never quite got there. But to say the case is unsolved is not the same as saying the truth is unknown. The truth has always been known. It was known by the detectives who worked the case from the first day. It was known by Susan's family. It was known by the prosecutors who built a file thick enough to fill a room, but never thick enough to satisfy the legal standard they set for themselves. And it was known in some form by two small boys who went to their graves carrying memories that no child should ever have to carry. The truth is that Javril killed Susan Powell on the night of December 6, 2009. He did it in their home on Sarah Circle while their sons were present or nearby. He cleaned up the evidence as best he could, the wet carpet, the fans, the smell of cleaning solution. And then he loaded the boys into the minivan and drove into the West Desert. He disposed of Susan's body somewhere in that vast, empty landscape, in a location he had researched in advance. A location remote enough that 2 years of searching by trained professionals with specialized equipment could not find it. He drove back to the area, went through the motions of a camping trip, enough to create an alibi however thin, and returned home Monday afternoon, acting surprised to find Susan gone. That is what happened. Everyone who investigated this case believes it. The West Valley City Police Department officially named Josh Powell as a person of interest and stated publicly, after his death, that he's the only suspect they had ever seriously considered. The FBI, which assisted with the investigation, concurred. The prosecutors in Salt Lake County, who had been building their case for over 2 years, stated after Josh's death that they had been preparing to present the case to a grand jury, and were confident that an indictment would have followed. The question that haunts everyone connected to this case is not what happened. It is why it was not stopped. Why the system moved so slowly. Why Josh Powell was allowed to remain free for 2 years. Why he was given access to his children. Why every opportunity to prevent the final tragedy was missed, delayed, or undermined by legal caution and institutional inertia. To understand this, you have to understand how the investigation unfolded in real time, not with the clarity of hindsight, but in the fog of competing priorities, jurisdictional complications, and legal constraints that the people on the ground were navigating every day. The first complication was jurisdictional. Susan disappeared in Utah. Josh fled to Washington. The crime, if it could be proven, occurred in Utah. But the suspect and the children were in Washington. This meant that 2 separate legal systems were involved, each with its own courts, its own child welfare agencies, its own procedures, and its own pace. Utah detectives could not simply knock on Josh's door and Puyallup and arrest him. Washington courts were not bound by the findings of Utah investigators. And the federal government, while providing assistance through the FBI, did not have primary jurisdiction over what was, at that point, still officially a missing persons case. This jurisdictional gap created delays at every stage. Evidence gathered in Utah had to be shared with Washington authorities through formal legal channels. Court orders issued in Utah had to be recognized and enforced by Washington courts. Custody proceedings that began in Utah had to be transferred to Washington when Josh moved there. Each of these steps required paperwork, hearings, filings, and time. Time that Josh used to entrench himself, to build his narrative, to isolate the boys, and to prepare for whatever he was planning. The second complication was the nature of the evidence itself. Circumstantial evidence, no matter how voluminous, no matter how compelling, is inherently more difficult to prosecute than direct evidence. A confession, a body, an eyewitness, a murder weapon. Any one of these would have been enough to charge Josh within weeks of Susan's disappearance. Without them, prosecutors had to weigh every piece of evidence not only for its individual strength, but for its cumulative impact on a jury. They had to anticipate every defense argument, every alternative explanation, every reasonable doubt that a skilled defense attorney could plant in a juror's mind. And they had to do all of this in a case that was receiving national media attention, where the stakes of failure were enormous and the pressure to act was constant. The prosecutors were not wrong to be cautious. The history of American criminal justice is littered with cases where prosecutors moved too quickly, charged too soon, and lost at trial, leaving a guilty person free forever under the protection of double jeopardy. The prosecutors in the Susan Powell case did not want to add to that history. They wanted to win. They wanted justice for Susan. And they believed, perhaps correctly, perhaps not, that the best way to achieve justice was to wait for the evidence to reach a tipping point where conviction was virtually certain. But the tipping point never came, not because the evidence was insufficient. By 2011, the case against Josh was overwhelming, but because the one piece of evidence that would have made the case airtight was the one piece Josh had ensured would never be found: Susan's body. Without it, the prosecutors continued to hesitate. And while they hesitated, the clock was ticking on a tragedy that no one saw coming because everyone was looking in the wrong direction. The third complication, and in many ways the most consequential, was the custody battle. The fight over Charlie and Braden became a parallel proceeding that consumed enormous resources, generated enormous emotion, and ultimately created the conditions for the February 5th murders. After Josh moved to Puyallup in January 2010, the Cox family immediately began legal proceedings to gain custody of, or at least regular access to, the boys. The proceedings were complicated by the fact that Josh had not been charged with any crime. He was a suspect, a person of interest, a man that everyone believed had killed his wife, but in the eyes of the law he was a free citizen with full parental rights. And in both Utah and Washington, parental rights are among the most heavily protected legal rights that exist. The legal standard for terminating parental rights in Washington state required clear, cogent, and convincing evidence that the parent was unfit. Being suspected of murder, in the absence of charges or a conviction, did not meet this standard. Being investigated for murder did not meet this standard. Even living in the home of a man who would later be convicted of terrorism did not, by itself, meet this standard, though it came closer. Chuck and Judy Cox fought through this legal framework with everything they had. They hired attorneys, they filed motions. They appeared in court repeatedly, sometimes driving hours to reach the courthouse, sometimes missing work, sometimes choosing between legal fees and household expenses. They were not wealthy people. They were a retired couple living on fixed income, suddenly thrust into a legal battle against a man who had killed their daughter and was now using their grandchildren as leverage. The emotional toll was immense, the financial toll was devastating, and the legal toll, the constant, grinding frustration of a system that seemed designed to protect the perpetrator at the expense of the victims, was enough to break anyone. But Chuck Cox did not break. Judy Cox did not break. Susan's siblings did not break. They kept fighting, they kept showing up. They kept telling judges and social workers, and anyone who'd listened, that Josh Powell was dangerous, that the boys were not safe, and that every day that passed without intervention was a day closer to disaster. And they were right. They were right about everything. And the system did not listen in time. The custody proceedings went through multiple phases. Initially, the Cox family sought visitation rights, which were granted on a limited basis after months of litigation. Josh resisted every request, filed counter motions, and used every procedural tool available to delay and obstruct. He argued that the Cox family was biased against him, that their involvement would confuse the children, that he was the only parent the boys had, and that his rights should be respected. The courts, bound by the legal framework they operated within, tried to balance competing interests. They granted the Coxes visitation. They ordered Josh to participate in evaluations. They appointed guardians ad litem to represent the children's interests. They held hearings, they issued rulings. They did what courts do, they followed the law. and the law in this case, was catastrophically inadequate to the situation. When Stephen Powell was arrested in September 2011 and the boys were placed in foster care, the dynamics shifted dramatically. For the first time, the state had a clear legal basis for removing the children from Josh's custody, not because Josh was suspected of murder, but because the home environment was deemed unsafe due to Stephen's charges. The Cox family immediately petitioned for permanent custody. Josh immediately fought back. The court ordered Josh to undergo sexual evaluation, the same evaluation he later refused to complete. The court also ordered him to maintain supervised visits with the boys while the evaluation was pending. These orders were, in the context of what everyone knew about Josh, laughably insufficient. A psychosexual evaluation, supervised visits, for a man that 2 state police departments and the FBI believed had murdered his wife and was capable of further violence. The gap between what the situation required and what the legal system was willing to do was vast, and it was into that gap that Charlie and Braden fell. There were people within the system who recognized the danger. Elizabeth Griffin Hall, the social worker assigned to supervise Josh's visits, had expressed concerns about the arrangement. She had told her supervisors that she felt uncomfortable being the sole point of contact during visits, that she was, in effect, the only thing standing between Josh and unsupervised access to his children, and that she was not equipped to handle a situation that turned violent. Her concerns were acknowledged but not acted upon. The protocols did not require law enforcement presence during supervised visits. The protocols did not require multiple supervisors. The protocols assumed that a parent, even a dangerous one, would not harm his own children during a court-ordered visit. The protocols were wrong. In the aftermath of the February 5th murders, a public outcry erupted that was unlike anything the state of Washington had seen in years. People were angry. They were angry at Josh, obviously, but they were also angry at the system, at the judges who had allowed the visits, at the social workers who had facilitated them, at the prosecutors who had not charged Josh sooner, at the laws that had prioritized parental rights over child safety. Letters flooded the offices of state legislators. Editorials appeared in every major newspaper in the state. Advocacy groups that had been pushing for custody reform for years suddenly found that the public was paying attention. The Washington state legislature responded with unusual speed. Within months, lawmakers introduced a package of bills aimed at addressing the specific failures that had led to the Powell tragedy. The bills, which passed with broad bipartisan support, included provisions that required courts to consider active criminal investigations when making custody decisions, that gave judges greater authority to deny or restrict visitation in cases involving violence, that mandated safety assessments before visits between children and parents suspected of serious crimes, and that required the Department of Social and Health Services to develop new protocols for supervising high-risk visits. Governor Christine Gregoire signed the bills into law in a ceremony that Chuck Cox attended. He stood behind the governor, watching her sign documents that bore his grandchildren's names, and he held himself together with a composure that everyone in the room recognized as an act of extraordinary will. Later, speaking to reporters, he said that the laws were a step forward, but that nothing would bring his grandsons back. He said that the system had failed Charlie and Braden. He said that he hoped no other family would have to go through what his family had gone through. But he also said something else. He said that the laws were not enough. He said that laws are only as good as the people who enforce them, and that the people within the system, the judges, the social workers, the attorneys, the administrators, needed to change the way they thought about cases like this. They needed to stop treating custody disputes as procedural exercises and start treating them as safety assessments. They needed to listen to families who were raising alarms. They needed to err on the side of caution when children's lives were at stake. They needed to understand that following procedure and protecting children are not always the same thing, and when they conflict, the children must come first. Chuck Cox spent years after the tragedy advocating for these changes. He traveled across the country speaking to lawmakers, judges, social workers, law enforcement officers, and advocacy groups. He told his family's story not because he wanted sympathy, but because he wanted action. He became a leading voice in the movement for child custody reform, and his advocacy contributed to changes in multiple states, not just Washington, but Oregon, Utah, and others that examined their own laws in the wake of the Powell case and found similar gaps. Judy Cox, Susan's mother, carried her grief more privately. She had lost her daughter. She had lost her grandsons. She had spent years fighting a legal battle that ended in the worst possible way. The cumulative weight of these losses was something that no parent, no grandparent, no human being should ever have to bear. Judy continued to support Chuck's advocacy work, but she also withdrew from public life to some degree, seeking solace in her faith, her surviving children, and the memories of the people she had lost. Susan's siblings, Mary, Denise, and John, each found their own ways of coping. Some spoke publicly about the case, others did not. All of them carried the knowledge that their sister had done everything right, had recognized the danger, had documented it, had planned her escape, had told the people she trusted, and that it had not been enough. This knowledge is a particular kind of burden. It challenges the fundamental belief that preparation can protect you, that awareness can save you, that the system will work if you just do your part. Susan did her part. The system did not do its. The media coverage of the Susan Powell case was extensive and sustained, spanning from December 2009 through February 2012 and beyond. The case became a fixture on national true crime programs. Dateline NBC dedicated multiple episodes to it, as did 48 Hours 2020 and America's Most Wanted. Local news outlets in both Utah and Washington covered every development exhaustively. Newspapers, websites, and blogs followed the case in real time, and the public engagement was enormous. The media played a complicated role in the case. On one hand, the coverage kept Susan's story in the public consciousness, generated tips for investigators, and put pressure on the legal system to act. Without media attention, it is possible that the case would have faded from public view, that Josh would have been left even more undisturbed, and that the advocacy efforts that followed the tragedy would have had less impact. On the other hand, media also gave Josh Powell a platform. His interviews, his public statements, his carefully constructed narrative of innocence, all of these were amplified by media coverage that, in the interest of balance, presented his version of events alongside the evidence against him. Josh was not a compelling interview subject. He was stiff, evasive, and transparently dishonest. But his willingness to speak publicly created a veneer of openness that may have confused some members of the public who were not following the case closely. The media also faced criticism for the way it covered the February 5th tragedy. Some commentators argued that the graphic details of the murders, the hatchet, the gasoline, the explosion, were reported in a way that was gratuitously detailed and potentially traumatizing to the public. Others argued that the details needed to be known, that the public had a right to understand exactly what had happened and exactly how the system had failed. This tension between the public's right to information and the potential harm of graphic reporting is a recurring theme in true crime media, and the Powell case became a case study in how to navigate it. The case also raised broader questions about domestic violence, coercive control, and the way the legal system handles cases where one partner is systematically abusing the other. Susan Powell's experience was textbook coercive control. Josh managed her finances, monitored her communications, isolated her from her support network, belittled her in front of others, and used their children as instruments of control. These behaviors are now widely recognized as hallmarks of domestic abuse, but in 2009 and 2010, the legal and cultural understanding of coercive control was less developed than it is today. Susan's case became a touchstone for domestic violence advocates, who argued that the legal system needed to take coercive control more seriously, not just physical violence, but the pattern of psychological manipulation and domination that often precedes it. The journals that Susan kept, the warnings she gave to her friends and family, the steps she took to prepare for leaving, all of these were evidence of a woman who understood that she was in a coercive, dangerous relationship and who was trying to escape it. The fact that she was unable to escape, that the danger she recognized and documented ultimately caught up with her, was used by advocates to illustrate the inadequacy of a legal system that focuses primarily on physical harm and often fails to recognize or respond to the broader pattern of abuse that leads to it. In the years after the tragedy, several organizations used the Susan Powell case in their training materials for law enforcement, social workers, and judges. The case was cited in academic papers on domestic violence, coercive control, and family court reform. It was discussed at conferences and seminars across the country, and it became, for many people who work in the field of domestic violence prevention, a symbol of what happens when the system fails. Not because the people within it are malicious or incompetent, but because the system itself is not designed to handle the kind of calculated, long-term, methodical abuse that Josh Powell inflicted on his family. The case also highlighted the specific dangers faced by women who are preparing to leave abusive relationships. Domestic violence researchers have long known that the period immediately before and after a woman leaves an abuser is the most dangerous time, the time when the abuser is most likely to escalate, most likely to become violent, most likely to kill. Susan was in this period when she disappeared. She had been consulting with a divorce attorney. She had been setting aside money. She had been making plans. And Josh, who had been monitoring her communications, knew all of this. He knew she was preparing to leave, and he acted before she could. This dynamic, the abuser's awareness of the victim's exit plan, and the violence that follows, is one of the most lethal patterns in domestic violence. It is also one of the hardest to prevent, because the very steps that a victim takes to protect herself, confiding in friends, consulting attorneys, opening separate bank accounts, documenting abuse, can also alert the abuser to the fact that she is planning to leave. Safety planning, which is the term used by domestic violence professionals for the process of preparing to leave an abusive relationship, must account for this risk. And in Susan's case, the safety planning was not enough. The lessons of the Susan Powell case are not abstract. They are concrete, specific, and actionable. They include the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies across state lines, the need for prosecutors to act more quickly in cases where the evidence of guilt is overwhelming, even in the absence of a body, the need for family courts to prioritize child safety over parental rights in cases involving suspected violence, the need for social workers to have better training, better resources, and better protocols for handling high-risk cases, the need for the legal system to recognize coercive control as a form of abuse that can be as dangerous as physical violence, and the need for everyone, judges, lawyers, social workers, law enforcement officers, neighbors, friends, family members, to listen when a woman says she is afraid. Susan said she was afraid. She said it in her journals. She said it to her friends. She said it to her family. She said it to her church leaders. She said it clearly, repeatedly, and with a specificity that left no room for misinterpretation. And the people she told believed her. They took her seriously. They tried to help. But the systems that were supposed to protect her, the legal system, the law enforcement system, the child welfare system, did not move fast enough, did not act decisively enough, and did not prioritize her safety or the safety of her children over the procedural requirements and legal constraints that governed their operations. This failure was not inevitable. It was the result of choices made by individuals, choices made by institutions, choices embedded in laws and policies and protocols, and valued process over protection. And the tragedy of the Susan Powell case is that those choices, each of which seemed reasonable in isolation, combined to create a catastrophe that killed a mother and her 2 sons and left a family shattered beyond repair. The West Desert is still out there. Thousands of square miles of flat, dry, empty land stretching west from the Salt Lake Valley toward the Nevada border. The Aquar Mountains still rise above West Valley City. The houses on Sarah Circle still look the same, beige and brown, close together, quiet. The house where Susan and Josh lived has new occupants now, people who may or may not know the history of the address. The neighborhood goes on. The schools go on. The church congregations go on. Life goes on because it always does, because it has to. But somewhere in that desert, Susan Powell is still waiting to be found. And the people who loved her have never stopped looking. The search for Susan's remains has been one of the longest and most exhaustive missing persons recovery efforts in Utah history. It did not end with Josh's death. It did not end with Stephen's conviction. It continued for years, driven by the belief, shared by investigators, the Cox family, and the public, that Susan deserved to be found, that her family deserved to bring her home, and that the land itself held answers that no living person was willing to give. In the months and years after Josh's murder-suicide, the West Valley City Police Department and the FBI conducted multiple additional searches of the West Desert. These searches were informed by new analysis of the digital evidence recovered from Josh's computers, evidence that had been partially processed before his death, but that continued to yield information as forensic analysts worked through the massive volume of data. One of the most significant pieces of digital evidence was a set of mapping searches that Josh had conducted on his home computer in the weeks before Susan's disappearance. These searches focused on a specific area of the West Desert, a cluster of abandoned mine shafts and natural depressions located roughly 90 minutes west of West Valley City. Accessible by unpaved roads that would have been navigable in a minivan, but that led to terrain so remote that casual visitors would have no reason to go there. The area was consistent with the cell tower data that placed Josh's phone in the West Desert in the early morning hours of December 7th, and it was consistent with the timeline that investigators had constructed for the night of Susan's disappearance. Detectives focused their searches on this area repeatedly. They brought in heavy equipment to excavate mine shafts that had been sealed or partially collapsed. They used ground-penetrating radar to scan the desert floor for anomalies that might indicate a burial site. They brought in cadaver dogs, animals trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, even through layers of soil and rock, and walked them across grid patterns that covered hundreds of acres. They drained standing water from flooded mine shafts and sent divers into underground chambers that had not been entered in decades. They found nothing. The desert is an unforgiving place to search for remains. The soil is hard packed in summer and frozen in winter. Wind moves sand and gravel across the surface constantly, reshaping the landscape in subtle ways that can obscure evidence within days. Mine shafts in the area number in the hundreds, some documented, some not, and many are deep enough that a body deposited at the bottom would be nearly impossible to locate without knowing the exact shaft. Animals, coyotes, ravens, insects, can scatter remains over a wide area in a matter of weeks, and time works against recovery in every way. The longer remains are exposed to the elements, the harder they become to find, to identify, and to recover intact. Investigators also considered the possibility that Josh had not buried Susan in the desert at all. Some theories suggested that he might have used a body of water, a reservoir, a lake, an irrigation canal to dispose of the remains. Others suggested that he might have used the industrial areas west of Salt Lake City, where construction sites and landfills could have provided cover. Still others suggested that Josh might have moved Susan's remains at some point after the initial disposal, that he might have returned to the site days or weeks later and relocated the body to a more secure location, making discovery even less likely. This last theory gained some traction when investigators discovered that Josh had made at least one trip back to the West Desert area in the weeks after Susan's disappearance. Cell phone records and witness statements placed him in the general vicinity, though the exact purpose of the trip could not be determined. If Josh had moved the remains, the already difficult search became exponentially harder because the forensic evidence, the cell tower data, the computer searches, the timeline, pointed to the original disposal site, not to wherever the remains might have been relocated. The searches continued intermittently through 2013, 2014, and beyond. Each search was smaller than the last, as resources dwindled and the probability of discovery decreased. The West Valley City Police Department, which had dedicated significant manpower and budget to the case for years, began to scale back its involvement. The FBI maintained a file on the case but reduced its active participation. The Utah Attorney General's office, which had taken over aspects of the investigation, continued to review evidence and coordinate with other agencies, but the pace of activity slowed. Through all of this, Chuck Cox remained a constant presence. He attended search operations when he was permitted to. He communicated regularly with investigators, asking for updates, offering to help. volunteering his time and energy in any way that might bring Susan home. He understood, as a retired man with a practical mind and a lifetime of experience, that the odds of finding Susan's remains were diminishing with each passing year. But he also understood something else. He understood that the search was not just about finding a body. It was about refusing to let Susan be forgotten. It was about insisting, through action and presence and sheer stubborn persistence, that his daughter mattered, that her life mattered, that her death mattered, and that the man who killed her would not have the final word. Chuck also continued to push for answers about what Stephen Powell knew. Even after Stephen's conviction and imprisonment, Chuck believed that Stephen held information about Susan's disappearance that he had never shared. Stephen had been Josh's closest confidant. Stephen had been Josh's refuge after the disappearance. Stephen had access to Josh's computers, Josh's files, Josh's communications. If anyone other than Josh knew where Susan was, it was Stephen. But Stephen never talked. He maintained throughout his legal proceedings and his time in prison that he knew nothing about Susan's disappearance. He maintained that Josh was innocent. He maintained that Susan had left voluntarily. He maintained these positions with a consistency that suggested either genuine belief or a level of commitment to deception that was remarkable, even by the standards of the Powell family. When investigators approached him with offers, reduced sentences, favorable treatment, the possibility of early release in exchange for information about Susan, Stephen refused. He was not interested in deals. He was not interested in cooperation. He was interested only in protecting his son's legacy and, by extension, his own. Stephen's death in 2018 closed the last realistic avenue for obtaining information about Susan's location through human sources. With both Josh and Stephen gone, the only remaining hope was physical evidence, the possibility that a hiker, a hunter, a construction crew, or a future search operation might stumble upon remains in the desert. The Cox family understood this. Investigators understood this. And the public, which had followed the case for nearly a decade, understood it too. The Susan Powell case file remains officially open. The West Valley City Police Department has stated that it will continue to investigate any new leads that emerge. The FBI has maintained its involvement in an advisory capacity. And the Cox family has made clear that they will never stop looking, never stop asking, never stop pushing for the answers that have eluded them for more than a decade. But the reality is that without a dramatic and unexpected discovery, Susan Powell's remains will likely never be found. The desert keeps its secrets, and the people who knew those secrets are all dead. Let me turn now to a part of this story that has received less public attention than the disappearance, the investigation, and the murders, but that is in many ways just as important. The psychological landscape of this case, the inner world of the people involved, is essential to understanding not just what happened, but why. Josh Powell was not a monster in the way that popular culture imagines monsters. He did not have horns or fangs. He did not live in a dark castle. He did not cackle or gloat or announce his evil intentions to the world. He was, by all external appearances, an ordinary man, unremarkable in his looks, his intelligence, his social skills, his professional achievements. He held jobs, he paid taxes, he attended church, he coached his son's sports teams, he mowed his lawn. He was, to the casual observer, invisible. The kind of person you pass in a grocery store without a second glance. This ordinariness is precisely what made him dangerous. Because the most dangerous abusers are not the ones who look dangerous. They are the ones who look like everyone else. They are the ones who can sit across a table from a detective and lie with a steady voice. They are the ones who can appear in court and present themselves as reasonable, concerned parents. They are the ones who can maintain a facade of normalcy so convincing that even people who suspect them begin to doubt their own instincts. Josh's ability to maintain this facade was extraordinary. In the 2 years between Susan's disappearance and his death, he gave multiple media interviews in which he presented himself as a victim, a man falsely accused, a father fighting to keep his family together, a husband who missed his wife and wanted her to come home. He sat in front of cameras and delivered these performances with a flatness that some viewers interpreted as grief and others interpreted as sociopathy. He answered questions with a practiced evasiveness, that never quite crossed the line into obvious deception. He said things like, "I miss Susan, and I want her to come home," with a mechanical quality that was unsettling but not in isolation incriminating. Behavioral analysts who reviewed Josh's interviews and public statements identified several patterns consistent with deceptive behavior. He frequently deflected questions by answering a different question than the one asked. He used passive constructions, "Susan is missing," rather than "someone took Susan," or "something happened to Susan." That avoided assigning agency or responsibility. He displayed what experts call duping delight. Micro-expressions of satisfaction that appear briefly on the face of a person who is successfully deceiving others. And he engaged in what is known as information management, carefully controlling what he revealed and withheld, releasing just enough detail to appear cooperative without providing anything that could be used against him. These behaviors are not unique to Josh Powell. They are common among individuals who have committed serious crimes and are attempting to evade detection. What was unusual about Josh was the duration and consistency of his performance. Most perpetrators who maintain a public facade eventually make mistakes. They contradict themselves. They reveal too much. They lose control of the narrative. Josh rarely made these mistakes. His story about the camping trip was absurd, but he never deviated from it. His denials were categorical and unwavering. His demeanor was controlled to a degree that suggested either genuine innocence or a level of emotional compartmentalization that bordered on the pathological. Psychologists who have studied the case, including some who were consulted by investigators during the active investigation, have offered various assessments of Josh's psychological profile. Some have suggested antisocial personality disorder, characterized by a pervasive pattern of disregard for others' rights, lack of empathy, and willingness to manipulate and deceive. Others have suggested narcissistic personality disorder, characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, a need for control, and an inability to tolerate perceived threats to one's authority or status. Still others have suggested that Josh's behavior was best understood not through diagnostic categories, but through the lens of coercive control, a pattern of domination that extends beyond individual acts of violence to encompass every aspect of the relationship. What is clear, regardless of diagnostic label, is that Josh viewed Susan not as a person but as a possession. He controlled her finances because he believed he had the right to decide how money was spent. He monitored her communications because he believed he had the right to know what she was thinking and saying. He dismissed her concerns about Stephen because he believed his judgment was superior to hers. And when she threatened to leave to exercise her own autonomy, to make decisions about her own life, he responded with the ultimate act of control. He killed her. This dynamic, the abuser's need for control and the violence that erupts when control is threatened, is the central psychological thread of the Susan Powell case. It explains not just Susan's murder but everything that followed. Josh's refusal to cooperate with police was an act of control. His flight to Washington was an act of control. His isolation of the boys was an act of control. His legal battles against the Cox family were acts of control. And his final act, the murder of Charlie and Braden and his own suicide, was the ultimate expression of control. If he could not have the boys, no one would. If he could not maintain his facade, he would destroy everything rather than face exposure, the boys themselves. Charlie and Braden are the most heartbreaking element of this story, and the one that is hardest to discuss without descending into a grief so deep that language fails. They were children. They were small and innocent and entirely dependent on the adults around them. They did not choose their father. They did not choose the circumstances of their lives. They did not understand, except perhaps in the fragmented way that young children understand, that their world was built on lies and violence, and that the person they trusted most was the person who posed the greatest danger. Charlie, who was 4 when his mother disappeared and 6 when he died, appears to have had some awareness of what happened on the night of December 6th. His statements to teachers and social workers about his mother going camping and not coming back, about his mother being in the trunk, suggest that he witnessed or heard something that left an impression on his young mind. Whether these impressions were memories, fragments of overheard conversations, or the confused processing of a traumatic experience is impossible to determine with certainty. Child memory is unreliable, particularly in very young children, and the statements Charlie made were never subjected to the kind of rigorous forensic interviewing that might have clarified their meaning. But the statements existed, they were documented, and they were one more piece of evidence that pointed to Josh, one more voice, however small and uncertain, telling the truth that Josh spent 2 years trying to bury. Braden, who was 2 when his mother disappeared and 4 when he died, was too young to have formed coherent memories of the night. He would have had no understanding of what happened, no ability to process the loss of his mother, no framework for making sense of the world he was growing up in. He knew only what he experienced, the presence or absence of the people around him, the warmth or coldness of his environment, the feelings of safety or fear that shaped his daily life. In the Powell household, and later in the foster care system, Braden's world was one of constant change, upheaval, and uncertainty. He was a child who needed stability and received none. The foster family that cared for Charlie and Braden after Stephen's arrest in September 2011 reported that both boys were showing signs of emotional distress. Charlie had nightmares. He was anxious in new situations. He asked questions about his mother that the foster parents did not know how to answer. Braden was clingy and prone to tantrums. Both boys had difficulty trusting new adults, a common response in children who have experienced disrupted attachments and unpredictable caregiving. The guardian ad litem appointed to represent the boys' interests in the custody proceedings recommended that the boys remain in foster care or be placed with the Cox family, and that Josh's contact be limited until he completed the court-ordered evaluation. This recommendation was based on the guardian's assessment that the boys' emotional needs were not being met in Josh's care, and that the environment in Stephen Powell's home had been harmful. The recommendation was reasonable. It was supported by evidence, and it was ultimately irrelevant because the system moved too slowly to implement it before Josh acted. In the final analysis, the story of Charlie and Braden Powell is a story about a system that treats children as objects in a legal proceeding, rather than as human beings with urgent, immediate needs. The boys were discussed in courtrooms, written about in legal filings, assessed by professionals, and debated by attorneys, but they were rarely, if ever, asked what they wanted. They were too young to participate meaningfully in the legal process, too young to advocate for themselves, too young to understand that the decisions being made in paneled rooms by adults in suits would determine whether they lived or died. Their deaths were not an unforeseeable tragedy. They were a preventable one. Preventable if the prosecutors had charged Josh sooner. Preventable if the courts had prioritized child safety over parental rights. Preventable if the social services system had required law enforcement presence during high-risk visits. Preventable if any one person in any one institution had said, "This is too dangerous. We are not going to allow this. We are going to protect these children, even if it means overriding a father's legal rights, even if it means facing legal challenges, even if it means being criticized for overreacting." No one said that, and Charlie and Braden paid the price. The ripple effects of the Susan Powell case extended far beyond the immediate family and the state of Washington. The case became a national conversation about domestic violence, child custody, and the failures of the systems designed to protect vulnerable people. It influenced legislation in multiple states. It changed the way social services agencies in Washington and elsewhere handled high-risk custody cases. It contributed to a growing body of research on coercive control, post-separation violence, and the dangers faced by children in custody disputes involving abusive parents. The case also had a profound impact on the law enforcement community. Detectives who worked the case in both Utah and Washington have spoken publicly about the emotional toll of the investigation. The frustration of building a case they believed was strong enough to prosecute, but that never went to trial, the horror of the February 5th murders, and the lingering sense that they could have done more, should have done more, that somewhere in the accumulation of evidence and legal proceedings, there was a moment when a different decision might have changed everything. Ellis Maxwell, the lead detective in West Valley City, continued to work the case after Josh's death. He reviewed evidence. He followed up on tips. He coordinated with federal investigators. And he carried the weight of the case with him in a way that those close to him described as visible, a heaviness in his posture, a distance in his eyes, the look of a man who had spent years trying to solve a puzzle, and then watched the puzzle destroy itself before he could finish. Other investigators described similar experiences. The case was, for many of them, the defining case of their careers, not because it was the most complex or the most challenging, but because it was the most painful. They had known the truth from the beginning. They had seen Josh for what he was. They had built the evidence, conducted the searches, written the reports, and pushed for action. And in the end, they had been unable to prevent the worst possible outcome. The prosecutors, too, carried the burden of what might have been. The decision not to charge Josh before his death has been debated extensively in legal circles. Some legal analysts have argued that the evidence was sufficient for an indictment as early as 2010, that the combination of digital evidence, witness testimony, Susan's journals, and the implausibility of Josh's alibi would have been enough to convince a grand jury, if not a trial jury. Others have argued that the prosecutors were right to wait, that a premature charge and a subsequent acquittal would have been worse than no charge at all, and that the real failure was not the prosecutor's caution, but the custody system's inability to protect the children independently of the criminal case. This debate will never be resolved. It cannot be resolved because the counterfactual, what would have happened if Josh had been charged in 2010, is unknowable. Perhaps he would have been convicted, imprisoned, and the boys would have been safe. Perhaps he would have been acquitted, emboldened, and the outcome would have been the same or worse. Perhaps the stress of a criminal trial would have triggered an earlier crisis. Perhaps it would have delayed it. The possibilities branch endlessly, and none of them can be tested. What can be said with certainty is that the system as it existed in 2009 and 2012 was not equipped to handle a case like this, a case where the suspect was intelligent, patient, methodical, and willing to die rather than face consequences. The system was designed for ordinary criminals, people who make mistakes, who confess under pressure, who leave evidence behind, who can be caught and convicted through standard investigative techniques. Josh Powell was not an ordinary criminal. He was a man who planned his wife's murder with the same cold precision that he would later use to plan his children's murders. He was a man who understood the system well enough to exploit its weaknesses, who used his parental rights as a weapon, who used his children as shields, and who ultimately used them as victims. The system has changed since then. The laws that bear Charlie and Braden's names have closed some of the gaps that Josh exploited. Training programs have been updated. Protocols have been revised. But systems are only as good as the people who operate them. And people are fallible, distracted, overwhelmed, and operating under constraints that no training program can fully address. The next Josh Powell may already be out there. Ordinary-looking person in ordinary-looking house, maintaining an ordinary-looking life, while behind closed doors. The machinery of control and violence turns slowly, waiting for the moment when it all comes apart. The digital evidence in the Susan Powell case deserves its own examination, because it represents one of the most extensive and revealing forensic technology investigations in any missing persons case of its era. The volume of data recovered from Josh Powell's devices, and later from Stephen Powell's, was staggering in both its quantity and its implications. It told a story that Josh never intended anyone to read, a story written not in words but in search queries, file deletions, timestamps, and the quiet digital footprints that modern life leaves behind whether we want it to or not. When West Valley City detectives executed search warrants on the Powell home in the days after Susan's disappearance, they seized multiple computers, external hard drives, USB storage devices, and cell phones. The devices were sent to the Utah Regional Computer Forensics Laboratory, a joint facility operated by the FBI and local law enforcement, where analysts began the painstaking process of extracting, cataloging, and interpreting the data. The first thing analysts noticed was that Josh had attempted to destroy evidence. Multiple files had been deleted from his primary computer in the days between Susan's disappearance and the execution of the search warrant. The deletion was not casual, it was systematic. Josh had targeted specific files and folders, and he had used methods that went beyond simply dragging items to the recycle bin. He had attempted to overwrite data clear browser histories and remove traces of his digital activity with a thoroughness that suggested he understood, at least in general terms, how digital forensics worked. But digital deletion is rarely as complete as the person performing it believes. Modern forensic tools can recover data from hard drives even after it has been overwritten, because the physical structure of a hard drive retains traces of previous data in ways that are invisible to standard software, but accessible to specialized recovery tools. The analysts in Utah were able to recover a significant portion of the deleted material, and what they found was damning. The recovered data included internet search histories that told a timeline of premeditation. In the weeks before December 6th, Josh had searched for information on a range of topics that no innocent person would have reason to research. He searched for how to dispose of a body in the desert. He searched for the decomposition rates of human remains in different soil types and temperatures. He searched for cleaning agents that were effective at removing blood and biological material from carpets and upholstery. He searched for the specific area of the West Desert where his cell phone would later ping on the night of the disappearance. He searched for information about abandoned mine shafts in Utah. He searched for methods of concealing evidence from law enforcement. Each of these searches, taken individually, might be explained away: a true crime enthusiast doing research, a writer gathering material, a curious mind following a dark rabbit hole. But taken together, in sequence, in the weeks before his wife vanished from their home, they formed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. Josh had been planning Susan's murder. He had been researching it the way a person researches a project, methodically, systematically, covering every contingency. And he had conducted this research on his home computer, apparently confident that he could erase the evidence afterward. The recovered data also included evidence of Josh's surveillance of Susan. He had installed software on Susan's devices that allowed him to monitor her email, her text messages, and her web browsing. He had been reading her communications with friends, family members, and crucially her divorce attorney. He knew that Susan was planning to leave him. He knew the timeline, he knew the details. And he had used this knowledge not to address the problems in their marriage, not to seek counseling or compromise, but to prepare for the moment when he would ensure she never left. This digital surveillance was, in its own way, as chilling as the search histories. It revealed a man who viewed his wife's private thoughts and communications as his property, something he had a right to access, to monitor, to control. It revealed a man who responded to the threat of losing control not by adjusting his behavior but by tightening his grip. And it revealed a man who used the information he gathered through surveillance to stay one step ahead of his wife, to anticipate her moves, to ensure that when the moment came, she would be unable to escape. The forensic analysis also uncovered financial records that supported the theory of premeditation. In the months before Susan's disappearance, Josh had made changes to the family's finances that were consistent with someone preparing for a future without his wife. He had adjusted life insurance policies, increasing the coverage on Susan while maintaining his own at lower levels. He had moved money between accounts in ways that were difficult to trace. He had made purchases, cleaning supplies, tarps, fuel, that did not align with any known household project or activity. These financial maneuvers were subtle. They were not the kind of dramatic, easily detectable changes that would trigger immediate suspicion. They were the quiet adjustments of a man who was thinking ahead, who was covering his bases, who was ensuring that when the time came, the financial aftermath would be manageable. They were, in other words, exactly what a person would do if they were planning to kill their spouse and continue living as though nothing had happened. The cell phone data provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. Josh's phone records from the night of December 6th and the early morning of December 7th showed a pattern of activity that contradicted his camping story in multiple ways. His phone pinged towers in the West Desert area between approximately 20:30 a.m. and 50:00 a.m., a window that was consistent with a round trip from West Valley City to the remote area where investigators later focused their searches. The ping showed movement. The phone was not stationary, as it would have been if Josh were sleeping at a campsite. It moved in a pattern consistent with driving, stopping, and driving again. More telling was what the phone data did not show. There were no calls made or received during this window. There were no text messages. There was no data usage. Josh's phone was on. It was communicating with cell towers, but Josh was not using it. He was, it appeared, simply driving through the desert in the middle of the night with his phone in his pocket, doing something that required both hands and his full attention. The phone data also showed that Josh made a call the following morning, Monday, December 7th, to his employer, leaving a message that he would not be coming to work. This call was made before he returned to West Valley City, before he supposedly discovered that Susan was missing. It was the call of a man who knew he would not be going to work that day, because he had been up all night, because he had something to do that morning, because his schedule had been disrupted by events he had set in motion the night before. Investigators also examined Susan's digital footprint and found a sharp cessation of all activity on the night of December 6th. Her phone, which she typically used throughout the evening, texting friends, checking email, browsing the internet, went silent at approximately 80:00 p.m. There were no outgoing communications after that time. There were no incoming communications that were answered. Her phone remained powered on for several hours after 80:00 p.m. It continued to communicate with cell towers, but no one was using it. By midnight, the phone was off entirely. This timeline was consistent with the theory that something had happened to Susan at approximately 80:00 p.m. After the boys were put to bed, after the house was quiet, after the last normal moment of a life that would never have another normal moment. The exact sequence of events between 80:00 p.m. and midnight, when Josh's phone began pinging towers in the West Desert, remains unknown. But the digital evidence suggests a window of approximately 4 hours during which Josh was in the house with Susan, during which her phone fell silent, during which the wet spot on the carpet and the smell of cleaning solution and the two fans blowing cold air across the living room floor all came into being. 4 hours. That was the window in which Susan Powell's life ended and the cover-up began. 4 hours in which a man who had spent weeks researching and planning executed his plan, cleaned up after himself, loaded his children into a minivan, and drove into the desert to dispose of the evidence. 4 hours that no one witnessed, that no camera recorded, that no neighbor heard, that left behind only the faintest traces, digital breadcrumbs, chemical residues, a damp patch on a carpet, that would take investigators years to fully interpret. The digital evidence was shared with prosecutors in Salt Lake County, who added it to the growing case file. By 2011, the file contained thousands of pages of reports, analysis, and documentation. It contained the internet searches, the cell phone data, the financial records, the surveillance software, the recovered deleted files. It contained Susan's journals, with their explicit warnings about Josh. It contained witness statements from dozens of people who had observed Josh's controlling behavior, Susan's fear, and the toxic dynamics of the Powell family. It contained the results of physical searches, forensic analyses, and expert consultations, and yet the prosecutors still did not charge Josh. The reasons for this continued hesitation have been debated extensively. Some observers have pointed to institutional caution, the inherent conservatism of a prosecutor's office that measures its success by conviction rates and is reluctant to bring cases it might lose. Others have pointed to the specific challenges of the case: the absence of a body, the absence of a confession, the absence of an eyewitness, the fact that the strongest evidence was circumstantial and digital rather than physical. Still others have pointed to political considerations. The case was high profile, the media scrutiny was intense, and a failed prosecution would have been devastating for the careers of everyone involved. Whatever the reasons, the delay had consequences. Every month that Josh remained free was a month in which the boys remained in his control, a month in which evidence could be lost or degraded, a month in which the Cox family's legal and emotional resources were further depleted, and a month in which the possibility of a violent resolution grew incrementally more likely. In the fall of 2011, after Stephen's arrest and the boy's placement in foster care, the prosecutors appeared to accelerate their timeline. There were reports, later confirmed by sources within the investigation, that the case was being prepared for presentation to a grand jury, that investigators were conducting final interviews and analyses, and that a decision on charges was expected within months. Whether this acceleration would have resulted in an indictment before February 5, 2012, is unknowable. The timeline suggests it might have been close, perhaps weeks away, perhaps days. But close is not the same as done, and in the Susan Powell case, the margin between almost and too late was measured in the lives of two small boys. After Josh's death, the prosecutors released a statement confirming that they had been actively preparing to charge him with Susan's murder. They expressed confidence in the strength of the evidence and regret that the case would never go to trial. They acknowledged the failures of the system while defending their own decision-making process, and they quietly closed the file, not officially, not permanently, but practically. There would be no trial. There would be no trial. There would be no formal, legal declaration of what everyone already knew. The digital evidence continued to be analyzed even after the case was effectively closed. Forensic experts worked through the remaining data on Josh's devices, looking for any information that might lead to Susan's remains. They found additional search queries, additional deleted files, additional fragments of a digital life that had been systematically scrubbed but not entirely erased. Some of this evidence was shared with the public through media reports. Some was kept confidential by investigators who hoped it might still prove useful. One discovery that was made public involved a document found on Josh's computer that appeared to be a checklist. The document was undated and partially corrupted, but the recoverable portions included references to cleaning supplies, fuel, and a list of items that needed to be handled before a specific date. The document was not definitive. It did not explicitly describe a murder plan, but its contents, combined with the other digital evidence, painted a picture of methodical preparation that was difficult to interpret as anything other than premeditation. Another discovery involved emails that Josh had sent in the final days before his murder-suicide. These emails, addressed to his attorney, his siblings, and a few close associates, contained instructions for the disposal of his property, the settlement of his debts, and the distribution of his remaining assets. They were, in effect, a last will and testament, drafted not by a lawyer but by a man who knew he was about to die and wanted to maintain control over his affairs even from beyond the grave. The emails also contained statements about Susan that were consistent with his long-standing narrative, that she had left voluntarily, that he was innocent, that the investigation was a persecution. But that now read as the final lies of a man who had spent 2 years lying and was about to commit an act that would make the truth irrelevant. The emails did not contain a confession. They did not contain the location of Susan's remains. They did not contain any acknowledgement of guilt. Josh Powell went to his death maintaining the same story he had told from the first day, that he did not know what happened to Susan, that he was innocent, that the world was wrong about him. Whether he believed this story, or whether it was simply the last performance of a man who had spent his entire adult life performing, is a question that died with him. Stephen Powell's devices, seized during the voyeurism investigation, yielded additional information that investigators found relevant to Susan's case. Stephen's journals, handwritten and extensive, contained references to conversations with Josh that suggested a level of knowledge about Susan's disappearance that went beyond what Stephen publicly acknowledged. In several entries, Stephen wrote about Josh's state of mind in the days after December 6th in terms that implied insider knowledge, not the observations of a concerned father learning about his daughter-in-law's disappearance through the media, but the reflections of a man who understood what had happened, because he had been told or because he had been involved. These journal entries were tantalizing but inconclusive. They did not contain explicit admissions. They did not describe specific acts. They did not provide the location of Susan's remains. They existed in the ambiguous space between knowledge and speculation, between complicity and willful blindness, and they could not be tested against Stephen's testimony, because Stephen refused to testify about anything related to Susan. Stephen's computers also contained files that had been transferred from Josh's devices, a discovery that suggested the two men had been sharing information and possibly coordinating their efforts to conceal evidence. The transferred files included some of the same deleted material that had been recovered from Josh's computers, raising the possibility that Stephen had served as a backup, a redundant storage system for evidence that Josh wanted to preserve, but could not safely keep on his own devices. This discovery reinforced the investigators' belief that Josh and Stephen had operated as a team, that the cover-up, like the crime itself, had been a collaborative effort between a father and son bound together by secrets, lies, and a shared willingness to protect each other at any cost. The full extent of Stephen's involvement will never be known. The evidence suggests complicity. It does not prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And with both men dead, the question has become academic, important for understanding the case but irrelevant to any future legal proceeding. The technology that enabled much of this investigation, the forensic tools that recovered deleted files, the cell tower analysis that tracked Josh's movements, the software that detected his surveillance of Susan, has continued to evolve in the years since the case. Modern forensic techniques are more powerful, more precise, and more comprehensive than those available in 2009 and 2010 storage GPS tracking, social media metadata, and the proliferation of connected devices have created a digital environment in which concealing evidence is harder than ever. Whether these advances would have made a difference in the Susan Powell case is debatable. The challenge was never primarily technological. The existing tools recovered an enormous amount of incriminating evidence. The challenge was legal. It was the gap between evidence and proof, between suspicion and conviction, between knowing and demonstrating beyond a reasonable doubt. Technology can close some of these gaps, but it cannot eliminate them entirely. And in a case where the suspect is willing to die rather than face justice, even the most advanced forensic technology reaches a limit. The Susan Powell case has become a reference point in the field of digital forensics, cited in training programs, textbooks, and professional conferences as an example of both the power and the limitations of technology-based investigation. It demonstrated what digital evidence can reveal about premeditation, motive, and opportunity. It demonstrated how surveillance technology can be used as a tool of abuse. And it demonstrated, painfully, that even overwhelming digital evidence is not always enough to prevent tragedy when the legal system does not act quickly enough to use it. The case also raised important questions about digital privacy and the balance between investigative access and individual rights. Josh's computers were seized under search warrants that were challenged by his attorneys as overly broad. Susan's journals, stored in a safety deposit box, were obtained through a separate warrant that was also challenged. The surveillance software that Josh installed on Sue's devices was itself potentially illegal, a violation of federal wiretapping laws that was never prosecuted because the perpetrator was dead before charges could be filed. These legal tangles illustrate the complex intersection of technology, privacy, and criminal investigation that continues to evolve as digital tools become more powerful and more pervasive. For investigators, the lesson of the Susan Powell case is that digital evidence is indispensable but not sufficient. It must be combined with traditional investigative techniques, witness interviews, physical searches, forensic analysis of crime scenes, and it must be acted upon with urgency. Evidence that sits in a file while prosecutors deliberate is evidence that is losing its value, because the suspect is still free, still capable of destroying evidence, still capable of committing further acts of violence. Speed matters, decisiveness matters, and the willingness to take calculated risks, to file charges before the case is perfect, to prioritize safety over certainty, to act on what the evidence shows rather than waiting for what the evidence might eventually prove, can mean the difference between justice and catastrophe. The Susan Powell case taught this lesson at the highest possible cost. 2 children paid for the system's caution with their lives. A mother paid for it with hers. and a family paid for it with a grief that will never fully heal, a loss that will never be fully understood, and a set of questions that will never be fully answered. The West Desert stretches on. The mine shafts sit in darkness. The sand shifts, and somewhere beneath it all, Susan Powell waits for the discovery that may never come, for the justice that will never be rendered, for the peace that only the truth can bring. And the truth, in this case, has always been known. It was written in search queries and cell phone pings and journal entries in the desperate words of a woman who saw what was coming and could not stop it. The truth was there all along. The system simply did not act on it in time. Susan Powell deserved better. Charlie and Braden deserved better. They deserved a world that listened when a woman said she was afraid. They deserved a legal system that moved with the urgency their situation demanded. They deserved adults who chose their safety over procedure, their lives over protocol, their futures over the cautious deliberations of institutions that measured risk in legal terms rather than human ones. Susan was 28 years old when she disappeared. She had spent nearly a decade married to a man who controlled her finances, monitored her private thoughts, dismissed her fears, and systematically dismantled the life she had tried so hard to build. She fought back the only way she knew how, quietly, carefully, with journals and safety deposit boxes, and whispered warnings to the people she trusted. She did not scream, she did not make scenes. She planned, she documented, she prepared, and in the end, none of it was enough, because the man she was trying to escape had been planning too, and his plan was further along than hers. Charlie was Sibs when he died. He had his mother's eyes. He liked dinosaurs and cartoons and sitting in his grandfather's lap. He said things that suggested he remembered something about the night his mother vanished. Fragments, impressions, the half-formed memories of a child who had seen too much too young. He never got the chance to grow up, to make sense of those memories, to understand what had happened to his family, to become the person his mother had dreamed he would be. Braden was 4. He was quiet and small and clung to the people who made him feel safe. He had no memories of his mother that he could articulate, no understanding of why his world kept changing, no framework for the chaos that defined his short life. He knew warmth and cold, comfort and fear, presence and absence. He knew that some arms felt safe and others did not. And on a Sunday afternoon in February, in a house that smelled like gasoline, even that small knowledge was taken from him. Chuck and Judy Cox buried their grandsons. They had already lost their daughter. They had already spent years fighting through a legal system that moved too slowly, listened too little, and protected the wrong person. They had already exhausted their savings, their energy, and their faith in institutions that were supposed to help. And then they stood at 2 small graves and said goodbye to the last living pieces of their daughter. And they somehow found the strength to keep going, to advocate, to speak, to fight for changes that would protect other families from the same fate. The protocols changed. The training changed. But Susan is still missing. The desert still holds its secret. And the people who loved her still carry the weight of a story that has no ending. Only silence, the silence of an empty house on Circle. The silence of a courtroom where no verdict was ever read. The silence of 2 small boys who will never speak again. Thank you for listening. Good night and stay safe.